Thank you for joining us for this session. We are going to explore a little bit around fashion and activism and what the term means. I'm joined today by Jamie and Wilson, and my name is Jodi Hamilton. I'm the Strategy and Communications Director at Fashion Roundtable and also founder of Black Neon Digital and Project 2030. I'm going to hand over to Jamie now to describe a little bit of journey to date and also just what they are up to now. Jamie.
Thank you so much. I am Jamie Windust. I am a writer, author and contributing editor at Gay Times. My background is in fashion business, so I have a degree in fashion business and marketing and trend forecasting, and I basically try and use my experience as a trans person to highlight the accessibility for trans people within the fashion and creative industries. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson.
Pleasure to be here. My name is Wilson Oryema. I float in a few different spaces as an artist, a writer, social entrepreneur, and a sustainability advocate. But I would say the underpinning theme for all of my work is human consumption and its effects on human behavior and the environment. So this spans into fashion and the impacts our consumption has, or various things in documentaries and other industries. And I'm also the co-founder of a social change initiative called Regenerative Futures, which is about bridging the intergenerational gap through collaboration and conversation.
Thank you, amazing. To kick off, can I just first ask both of you, would you consider yourselves as an activist, firstly, and what does that term even mean to you personally? Jamie, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think for me, I have quite a difficult relationship with that word, purely because I think when you are a marginalized voice or body and you speak about your lived experience or the lived experience and shared experience of your community, what tends to happen is you are then labeled as an activist often without consent. I think you're just kind of heralded or pillared as someone that is constantly fighting for change, and it can be quite frustrating. And there are parts of my career where I have actively campaigned for things, and I've campaigned for change, which is fine. You could then call me a campaigner, but I think as someone who tries to make change, or also just does things because they love them, like writing or working in the fashion industry, I think it's difficult often to then break into new industries or to continue in the industries that you're in, because people see that prefix of activist that was kind of put on you by the people, and it can pigeonhole you and kind of make people see you as quite a niche entity. So what I try and do is I try and eradicate that, and I try and get rid of that. And you can call me whatever you like. I've been called many things, but activist for me, I personally don't align with that term. I just share my life and my community's experiences through my work. But yeah, it's a difficult word.
So, in your experience, you've found it a negative term, essentially. So it hasn't, supported pushing that change forward, and it's not been helpful and positive, perhaps, would you say?
I think there are definitely moments where it's a positive, and I think the word activist, being told or labelled as an activist, comes with a lot of privilege, and that is something that I think people who do active grassroots campaigning, actively self-embody themselves as an activist, deserve. To kind of just plant that word on certain people who share their experiences, I think is unfair, because it can provide a lot of presumptions on what that person then should do in their life. It's not a negative term completely. I appreciate the brilliance of it, and sometimes I like it, but I think it's something that should be self-determined and self-defined.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wilson, what's your views on fashion activism as a term, and have you ever personally used it or thought of yourself as an activist?
Personally, I don't use the term. I don't I think there's an excitement with trying to create, or within fashion in particular, there's a hype train where it's like, in order to excite viewers or audiences, you throw labels onto people so that it's like, so that it's more engaging for the audience. So it's like, oh, we're gonna call you every name under this. Like, I can't even. Activism is a great one but there's so many others. But I don't align with the word because I feel like it's almost like a title that isn't supposed to hold any weight apart from an aesthetic one. So it's like, oh, you look like you're like the activist people think of is typically someone who isn't really particularly doing much in their field, but they have like a feel-good aura about them. And I feel like you don't go into, I don't know, like you won't call like a head of a multinational corporation an activist, or whether that's like a Greenpeace or a fashion brand. It's like a weird designation for those who aren't. It's almost like, oh, what you're doing is cute. So I that's how it comes across to me. I personally don't mind the term though, because of course everyone uses terms in ways that are convenient for them to understand and relate to someone or something. So I personally don't use it, but I'm not opposed to it. But at the same time, I'm not going out of my way to choose it.
I think, you both picked up on something which is around like labeling and calling things, and something that's quite timely as well. I feel like, it's this today and that tomorrow, and then where do you fit in within that discussion, and I kind of feel like, we're all working towards something for a much bigger picture, a much longer view, like 10, 20, 30 years. And campaigning around a specific campaign perhaps doesn't give that, that longevity, that view, that future-facing view. Thinking about, the different communities that we all kind of represent and so forth, do you ever feel that there's like a burden on you personally to do, I'm not going to say like the work, but, really highlight things for a wider community than just yourself? And what does that feel like? Jamie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think in my position in my community, I hold a lot of privilege as a white person and as someone that is able to navigate the world in ways that are is easier than compared to a lot of people. So I do, the burden aspect of that, it is difficult because I do feel the burden, and I do, for example, this week and last week, there has been a lot of news, both in the fashion world and in kind of just like the political world, about transness. And I do often feel a pressure or kind of an obligation often to speak about these things, or to highlight them, or to even to just have a vocal opinion. For example, with Gucci recently shared that they have produced a gift guide for people who are neither male or female, and just the constant barrage of emails like, what do you think? And I'm just like, I genuinely don't care. there are bigger issues on my plate than whether or not they want me to buy a gift just because they've put them on it. Like, it's that type of burden that often I feel, because I constantly am asked to do things. And then the counterpart of that is the pressure to then do them in the right way, so that you feel like you represent your community well. Or I have always tried to say, and it took me a while to understand this, but last year I spoke about how, I'm just one person in this community. There is no one way to be trans or non-binary, and especially in the fashion industry, there's no one way to represent that. There's just an appropriate and right way. There's an accessible way. There's no one way. But that burden often feels a lot when you're having to kind of educate people or explain to people. It can kind of feel like you need to really say the right thing. That's why it's so important to get as many voices in as possible. because then they can create an education system that has the breadth and depth of a community. One person can never speak for a whole group of people.
It's also the pressure to be like on your A game every single day. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes you're not, and kind of, you know, that in itself is hard to deal with, I think. Have you found something similar, Wilson, or, you know, with your work?
Yeah, definitely. I think I can feel some sense of responsibility every day, or any time that I think about the work that I do. It affects the way that I portray or present myself online, how I act for the most part in my day-to-day life, and even the work and the projects and scale that I do. Like, I think, like I alluded to previously, there's typically a consideration within, like, say, activism or just like fashion or any creative space, where it's like, hey, we're going to talk about an issue, but we're not going to go into depths of it. We're just kind of show like a glossy presentation of the smallest possible what is it, like virtue signaling, or like just the easiest kind of possible task you can present about a particular problem without really trying to create any long-standing change. So I think, even though there does feel to be some responsibility, I am kind of encouraged by it. That's not to say that I don't suffer from pressures or just overthinking at times, where it's like you question your own space or person or value in the world. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that is needed to really make any long-standing change, because if you're not feeling, or for me at least, if I'm not feeling some type of responsibility or burden for something, I can't be, I'm less likely to be engaged with it for the long term.
Yeah, that makes sense. Would you say that there's something specific, like, so a lot of the times what I think about is like play forward the vision of the future. So, you know, I try to imagine what this world that I'm trying to create would look like. And, you know, what are the things that I need to do to make that change happen, and kind of quite, you know, work back quite systematically, kind of look at the building blocks to the bigger picture. Do you have, Wilson, a vision of the future that, you know, 5-10 years that you are kind of trying to aim for, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so as opposed to maybe a specific point, I would say there's like a range of potential futures that I would like to look at. So, like I said this recently in an interview, where as opposed to, sometimes you can, like, if you're reading a comic book or watching a movie, there's like one typical plot line you like to follow. I like following various different plot lines, which is why I enjoy, or which is why I partake in a few different projects, because you're not likely to succeed in everything you do. So if at least one of the things that you're doing succeeds, then you're much better off. So I would say there's like a spectrum where maybe if all of the various projects I work on succeed, that's amazing. But at least if one or two of them work well, then that takes us in a somewhat better position. So I would say that is kind of, there isn't, and it's too difficult to focus on a specific point to that far into the future. You can just hope more so. It's like getting your ducks in a row. So it's like, if I'm going to fish and I've got my fishing rod ready, I've got my bait, I've got snacks to keep me for the long day, I'm by a good body of water. Even if the fish that I specifically want doesn't get caught on the hook, I still have dozens of opportunities to catch something that is a good potential future. So in somewhat kind of like that, I'm trying for a few different things, and even if they don't work exactly how I intend them to, they probably will work in a way that does benefit and lead us to what I would consider a better future.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you actually fish then, Wilson, just out of interest? Because you seem to know
No,
exactly the
not at
process
all.
behind. I'm thinking, oh, that could be something. I've recently seen people getting more into like bird watching, which is quite interesting as well. I think, you know, now we're all connecting to nature a little bit more, or being able to have a bit of time actually.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, never fished it,
Yeah.
not once in my life.
Maybe it could be 2021 thing.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, Jamie, do you have a vision of the future, or several visions of the future that you would like to see?
I think I really like what Wilson said about getting your ducks in a row, because I think in terms of like the trans community and in terms of our presence in the fashion industry, we have, you know, representation is important, but representation is one part of the cog system. You know, it's one part of the picture. So I think in terms of the future, I think the state that we're in now, we have a situation where trans representation publicly in terms of campaigns and marketing is increasing, but the trans representation behind the scenes is not increasing. So in terms of actually with having designers consult trans people, having trans marketing teams, you know, all of these things that actually would benefit a business when using a marginalized group. That is my kind of hope for the future. And in my work this year, I've worked with kind of fashion brands and lifestyle brands on their Pride campaigns to kind of show them that actually a lot of people don't know what to do when it comes to Pride, and that's fine. But if you just sit back and ask the community that you're working with what to do and hire them and consult with them and, you know, create a mass of LGBTQ plus people to then create a brilliant campaign. It's by them for them. And I think that's what in the next 5 years we need to move forward into more, is having less front-facing activations by brands that are about a community and activations that are by them and for them. And whether that be, you know, highlighting small brands and continuing to do it that way through sustainable brands and independent brands, or by the larger brands realizing and holding their hands up and not realizing they don't necessarily always know what to do, and hiring more inclusive teams. I think both situations need to happen. But yeah, I'm optimistic, but I was optimistic about 2020, so.
Yeah, well, yeah, let's not go down that one. Something that I've been thinking a lot about actually is co-creation, and thinking about, like you've just said, you know, inviting people to work on things together collaboratively to create something better overall. And I think in the fashion industry, what we've seen is, you know, like it's been derived from a creative director and then, you know, goes through the marketing teams and gets sent out. And there's quite a lot of power with one person and a creative vision, or, you know, perhaps they're steered by an overarching bigger group with loads of money and being told, but, you know, what it looks like on the front is that ultimately it's one person's decision around creativity. And I think that's kind of shifting. I can feel a bit of a, you know, tectonic plate shifting now, and perhaps co-creation could be something quite magical. Do you know what I mean? And it could be where we can all get in. And I also think where you know, starting to happen a little bit more is there's groups of people who are supporting brands to actually work on whether it's a capsule collection or whatever it is, and get that engagement. Because from a really kind of cold perspective, when we're not putting emotion into it, it helps a brand sell before they've even made a product, you know. So there's lots of different ways why a brand would see that important. But I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts around co-creation? So you've sort of touched on it. Is it something that you've done previously through projects, or have an appetite to do, either of you? I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, this summer I worked with Teach and Jones, who are kind of known for their co-creation through utilizing, almost choosing like muses in a way, but using using their models to create the garments. So that this year I worked with them this summer on their kind of Relove collection, which is about sustainability, and the whole project was co-created. It wasn't just like they created a collection and then at the end they were like, oh, do you want to wear it? It was like, they'd researched the people, they'd researched the figures that they were using, they cared about the message and they cared about the people. And then what that does is, like you say, in an almost cold manner, if you look at it in a business sense, it does better because people can resonate and see that this project has actually had collaboration with all parties involved. And I think, the fashion industry has a history of collaborating between designers, but like you say, that power hierarchy with one person making all the decisions or an agency making all the decisions needs to go, because it doesn't actually benefit everyone. It just benefits a small privileged minority, I think. So yeah, and
there's also a lot of pressure on that particular person. We've seen historically in fashion, people who are at supposedly the top of their game, have to leave or incidents happen, and it's not actually beneficial in a mental health situation as well. Thinking about co-creation, actually, Wilson, I know that you attended Isabel Fletcher's private view, where she worked with dancers and things as well. So I sort of know Isabel, and just thinking about all the sorts of things that she talks about as well, I know is something that you're passionate about. Can you talk to us about your Regenerative Futures project, please? Because I don't really know much about that at the minute.
Yeah, for sure. I want to preface by just completely agreeing about co-creation. Even now we're seeing structures of power even beyond fashion, like you look at politics or pretty much anything. The idea of a central figure is slowly losing traction or its sexiness with the general public. So across the world, I think we're seeing that. And even I think it's also something that's needed to progress forward in terms of, because a lot of times, whether you're the person in power or it's someone else, there is this idea of ego to hold on to these to hold on to a specific idea that you have in mind. So that also ties into, like, say, for example, whether it's Regenerative Futures or some of the other projects I'm working on, it's a consideration of I may have an idea of how something goes, but at the same time, I don't need to be the chief ship or the steerer of that idea. It's like someone else might have a much better idea or just something completely different. And it's about being okay with not everything going your way, which is totally stressful sometimes. But at the same time, it's like the world isn't just for you, so you have to accept that. But anyway, Regenerative Futures is, so it's essentially a social change initiative, and our plan is to bridge collaboration and conversation between generations, because we feel that most problems in the world are rooted in this intergenerational gap, whether you're looking at Gen Zs to millennials to baby boomers to whatever other generations you consider. And the idea is through different approaches and projects, we want to just make it a much more flatter ground for all. So one of the projects we've got is the Regenerative List, which is a global list. Essentially, we're looking for 100, or we found 100 young innovators who are working on sustainable projects around the world, from using fruit waste to make products or textiles, to people who have got climate change platforms that are translating information into different languages, to systems that are addressing the issues in fast fashion within factories and various other things. So we've created a list of 100 people, and the idea is to give them, or what we've been working on is giving them access to funding, mentoring, and or media exposure, and that is relevant to them. So we're launching a list sometime this month, ideally, and then alongside that, we'll be launching the report. So the report is essentially a how can I describe it? Because typically with reports, it's like, oh, hey, we're going to just have like 100 pages of text and what we've done research, and this is what we think it should be. But for this report, we had like so many focus groups just speaking to Gen Zs around the world and getting their insights into what they think a better future is, and so on. So we decided to actually create a regenerative future. So we created like this platform where we have essentially, I can say it, essentially we've had these fictional characters based out, let's say 40 years into the future, who have created a settlement on Antarctica. And it's like, it's creating the world or that kind of space. And it's like, how did they move over there? What kind of currency do they have? Is it for anything that's being used today? What do their homes look like? So we've even sourced the efforts from one of the organizations that's on the regenerative list to design these kind of home pods, what that would look like. We're working with various organizations to kind of present like what would an ad in the future look like for someone around this space, or what a regenerative future would look like. So we've got that as well. We've got a summit coming up next year as well, and then just a few other things. So it's again kind of taking that taking that. There's a few things that could work, so it's good to just kind of push them out in somewhat different directions, but still be connected, so that they can provide, or so that even if some of them don't go exactly as we plan, there's still a rapid testing and potential of at least a few of them working really well. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing with regenerative futures.
Do you think then, so you've talked a bit about Gen Z, are you also going to be looking at, say, the baby boomers and then working specifically with those kinds of subsets of groups and then bringing everyone together to have the discussion as you know, across the board?
So
is that what you mean by intergenerational, yeah?
Yeah, so in some ways, say, for example, in the list, it's like, we're connecting the young people on the list with let's say mentors who from other generations who would be a great person to speak to or receive insight from, or just someone they can connect with, because not everyone needs a mentor in the same way, and sometimes it's just a business partnership which makes sense. In other ways it might be, oh, this person could be a great media platform for you to connect with. So in that context, is that for the report or for the platform, because as well as like the graphic novel, the report will exist as like a website and some other stuff. We're going to have like town halls and opportunities for different groups to come together and somewhat exist in this regenerative future that we created, and give them a chance to interact like that. With the summit as well, there's I can't go into too much detail about what that is, but it's just a great opportunity for, say, brands that you may know of, or people from different backgrounds and histories, and people who are just on the start of their journey, to come together and work together on projects and have like actionable results that are like, hey, this is what we worked on together, and come out of it. So there's different ways that we're bringing them all in together. However, in order to better position ourselves to support the future, the focus was more on the Gen Zs from the onset, and it's more about how can we, because one of the biggest issues is that essentially you've just got millions or maybe billions of kids who think in a 2D way in a 3D world, because they don't have any understanding of how to create impact outside. A lot of the for lack of a better word, activism or engagement from young people is purely from an internet-based space, and that's not a problem, because the internet, because it's permissionlessness, has given us great benefit. It's allowed us to do so much, but because of the bureaucracy or difficulties in many other industries that exist outside, there hasn't been enough opportunity for young people today. So we can see this in the lack of spaces they're given or opportunities. So we thought it was better to start with bringing with them and then bring everything towards them, in terms of who are the people we know that can help support them or help partner with them on this particular project or provide insight or whatever. So that's kind of why there's more of a focus on the young people for us. And then, so essentially, just to wrap up on this, it's a 4-year project. So we're going to do the list every year. We might do the summit every year, depending on how that goes. And then just a few other things in the other years, just because there's a risk sometimes of when something goes on when a non-profit goes on too long, it becomes less about the goals you had from the onset and more about how do we keep the lights on. So we want to kind of just do this as a quick kind of way to make great impact and see if there's something replicable and if other people kind of take the model and play with it and do it in their own way.
Sounds really exciting. I mean, I can't wait to see what comes of it as well. And I think something that you picked up on there around physical spaces, I think that there's still a lot of work to be done around claiming space and kind of our perception of who's allowed in the spaces that are within the cities or museums or certain areas of the city and things like that. I think it's really important to really work on the physical spaces that we feel permitted in or not permitted in, Jamie, what are you working on kind of that may come to fruition in 2021?
Great question.
Hopefully.
So this year I published my first book called In the Shoes, which is about my experiences through life, but also through fashion, to discover identity and discover kind of more about who I am. And I have really enjoyed over the past 2 years kind of looking into fashion as a political tool and looking into how lots of different people use fashion to represent themselves. And I think what I found most interesting actually is I just did a little mini series with Jamila Jamil, where I spoke with guests about how fashion has helped them become who they are now. And I think that's what I really like to investigate and move forward looking at. So hopefully next year I will be doing some work with Channel 4 on the ways in which we use gender expression and fashion to present ourselves to the world. And I find it really interesting to just look at people of all genders. People think that, obviously trans people and gender non-conforming people use fashion in ways that are very personal to them. But I really find it interesting to look at very traditional masculine, like working class men and how they use fashion and how, even this year, like looking at how key workers, how the uniform and how uniforms present themselves and all of these types of facets, I just find it absolutely nourishing. So I'm going to be looking into that next year, and hopefully you'll see that in some form.
Wonderful. I definitely hope so. Is there anything that you'd like to ask each other? Because I kind of, I always feel that there's room for that kind of that space. Do you want to ask each other anything?
I think I really enjoyed the ways in which you discussed the future project. I think what I find really interesting is how did you almost like burst through the thought of like, I want to do this, and then actually being like, let's do it? Because I think a lot of people have these like amazing thoughts and they're like, oh, I don't know how to actually turn this into something real. How did you kind of go from, I guess, seeds to tree?
That's a great question. Thank you. So with Regenerative Futures, I was the second or third co-founder to jump on. So I wasn't the initiator of the idea, but there's something else that I am, which I'll explain afterwards. But with Regenerative Futures, a friend was setting up a conference to essentially connect, essentially in the same way the list is doing, connect to like young people with leaders of industry. and put them in a room where it's like no phones, no distractions, and it's like everyone has to come out with a commitment. So it's like, oh, you've met the say for example, you could meet the head of Gay Times as a teen, and it's like, oh, they've promised to introduce you to this person or give you an opportunity to work at the brand or the organization for a month or something. And that was the idea. But of course, with COVID, it kind of switched. So it became, how can we then turn this into something that doesn't have to exist in a single space? So we thought, because we were always going to do the report, or the report was because we needed a new outlook on sustainability, because there's just a massive, I feel like the term has just become very misconstrued in terms of its understandings and definitions. So we wanted to, so it's just kind of been, I can't even describe it, because it's funny, because the co-founder of it is, I feel like we're almost twins in a weird sense, and she'll probably find that funny as well, but it's just because it's just having someone you bounce off so well with, where we'll just have 3-hour conversations, and then it's like, oh, we should do this instead, we should do this instead. And then it's just about doing the work, but that's probably not a great answer, so because it went so fluidly. But I'm working on this exhibition called Surface Tension, which should be launching early January 4th. And it's a virtual exhibition, and it's about the future of materials and what types of a focus on materials that have a benefit for the human body and the environment. Because even now, most people's understandings of materials now is just that, oh, COVID can exist on your clothing. So it's just like, we're going to carpet bomb or over sanitize our materials, when there's much more thought that needs to go into it in terms of what are the negative impacts. So like, I did this documentary called How Toxic Are My Clothes? And I've done this platform for it, and there's a follow-up documentary coming out at the end of next year. But so with the idea of Surface Tension, the exhibition I'm working on with this scientist and designer called Rosie Broadhead, it's that we've got a lot of contributors who are presenting materials or objects in this virtual space that there's a bet in the future. And so the first idea for that was that we wanted to work together, because she's made like clothes out of probiotics, and like a magnesium bikini, and like a t-shirt that has vitamin E in it and stuff. And we were thinking, what type of research labs or what type of organizations can we work together to approach and produce something? So it's like, what could we make a base layer for a spacesuit? And then we figured that the A to B of that is, the distance of that is a lot longer than we would like to hope or try to work on. So we thought, what's the easiest possible? And then we thought, what are the biggest hurdles or the biggest reasons that journey is, or that those points are so far apart? So we then determined that the best way is that you have to raise public awareness of this topic, which then essentially makes you like a thought leader or someone to be considered on this topic. So it's like, how do we bring attention to the potentials of materials using what we have? So fortunately with COVID, it meant that there's no reason to hold physical spaces. So it's like, okay, let's do an online exhibition. So it was finding what type of software can do that. So I'm building it in this platform called Ortelia Space Designer or Space Curator, but it's a great virtual platform. It's how many people and who can we reach out to. So reach out to a few people, like we've got Phoebe English in the show. I think we've also got who else do we have? We've got By Boar and just various other brands in the show, and people like we've got this organization which helps make spacesuits for NASA, who should potentially, hopefully, be in the show. But we've just got various people like that, and it's just reaching out to them like, hey, we want to build awareness for this topic. We think that you'll be someone great to contribute on. And then it's just kind of progressing from step to step in that. If it doesn't immediately come to mind what the answer is, it's like, it's asking what is the hurdle blocking our progression to this thing. So it's kind of like a mix of reaching for the lowest hanging fruit and also having the audacity to jump a bit higher than you're expected to. So I'd say that. And then my question for you is, I know you mentioned early on that for lack of a better word, activism or this responsibility is better shared with others. How do you like what would you say is like the best approach, or at least a few that you think should be encouraged more to kind of encourage everyone to feel more of a shared responsibility for the many issues we face? And it's not like we have to face all of them, but at least so one person can feel more considerate about one particular issue.
I think for me, when it comes to that emotional burden, what I try and explain to predominantly non-trans people is that often, you know, the burdens that we feel are not ours, are not our fault. So what I try and do is to alleviate that burden. I share it with allies in the hope that they will begin to take on some of that burden. I guess that means optimistically, I'm trying to say that we shouldn't have to feel it. Any of us should have to feel it. And I understand, I actually really liked what you said before about feeling like you need to have responsibilities and a little bit of burden to drive you. And I actually really, I've never thought of it like that, and I like that. But I think often what happens with this emotional burden is it weighs us down. So I try and speak to allies to be like, look, this is what's going on, because often they don't know, they're not aware. And hope that they can alleviate that. But yeah, it's a very tricky one, because you can't force people to care. And I think in my work, that's all I try and do is I try and plant seeds to make people think about things maybe slightly more differently in their own life, and then they can begin to see the bigger picture. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you. Really, really enjoyed listening and talking and learning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.